Thank you. Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy President. And what a really, really tragic day to be part of this parliament. Almost 3 years ago, I sat here, I sat on the other side, and voted for climate action. And it was the happiest day of my parliamentary life, and certainly one of the happiest days of my actual life. I was really proud of the parliament that day, and today I hang my head in shame and embarrassment at the absolute lack of vision of the people in this place, the willful ignorance and the placing of selfish greed ahead of the interests of the public interest and ahead of the interests of all of our children and those to come. I find it particularly embarrassing that Australia is the only country that is in fact going backwards on climate, when we have many of the world's other nations taking steps forward in all sorts of different ways, some huge steps forward, some small steps. And we saw last week the UK Tory Prime Minister come out and even say that he was embarrassed that Australia was stepping backwards. When we have that sort of clear signal from the rest of the world, and when this government continues to ignore that global action, again I hang my head in shame. And if I think about why it is that we're in this place, it's for a three-word slogan. It's for rank politics in a little rhyme, axe the tax. And to me that's the greatest tragedy, that there is an absolute lack of understanding, or perhaps a willful lack of understanding, of the significance of what it is that we're doing here tonight, and that it's being driven by that base rank politics simply to get elected off the back of mostly lies. Apparently we're in a budget emergency, and yet we know from costings from the Parliamentary Budget Office that the carbon price would bring in $18 billion over the forward estimates. Some budget crisis, if you're willing to forego $18 billion, given that money seems to be the only thing that makes any sense to these people, I would have thought that $18 billion would have made some kind of impact in their ideology, but apparently not. And I want to move now to the fact that the carbon price is not just, as Greg Hunt tries to claim, it's in fact not failing, it is in fact delivering, and perhaps that's why this government is so eager to get rid of it, because it is in fact doing its job, and it is in fact inconveniencing the big polluters who are lobbying so hard to get rid of it. Every time I hear this government and representatives of this government parrot the absolute tripe that the carbon price is not working, it makes me embarrassed to be a member of this place. The carbon price is working. In the first 6 months of the scheme, emissions from electricity generation came down by 7%. We know that since the carbon price was introduced, that total emissions from the national electricity market have fallen by more than 10%. We know that emissions from all sectors combined, excluding land use and forestry, fell 0.8%, and that's even despite the fact that the scheme only covers 60% of this nation's emissions, and yet total emissions have remained flat while the economy has continued to grow. One notable exception to that is the fact that emissions from coal seam gas and coal mining have risen, a massive 13%. Is it any wonder when this government, and quite frankly the last, have never met a coal mine or a coal seam gas application that they haven't approved? And again, I echo the comments of the excellent speech from Senator Milne, who spoke earlier about the fact that we have a complete bankruptcy of commitment to climate change when you have espousals for an emissions trading scheme with absolutely no detail on what the actual target for reducing pollution might be. Now, moving again back to money, which, as I say, seems to be the only thing that counts to this government. Households, they claim that they want to axe the tax because they're concerned about households. Well, what an absolute joke. If you are actually concerned about households, why on earth are you bringing down the harshest and cruelest and most unnecessary budget that we've seen in living memory? So I'm afraid any which way you turn it, there is no logic to this government's rationale. We know that households were overcompensated through the income tax changes for the impacts of the carbon price. We know that the carbon price was actually working, and we know that the economy was still growing. We know that emissions were coming down. There was absolutely no losers in this situation, except, of course, for the big polluters who don't like paying to pollute. They're all ready to sign up to this ridiculous direct action scheme, which nobody still seems to know what it is. It's gradually taking shape and still hasn't found anyone to back it or describe it with any sort of credibility. They're ready to line up for their handout from the taxpayer so that they can keep polluting, instead of what we now have, a scheme where they have to pay to pollute. I want to talk briefly about what's at stake, and again I echo the concerning and very well expressed remarks of Senator Milne before me. We know that extreme weather events are going to become more intense and more frequent, and I'm from Queensland, where we have an awful lot of them. And I remember that community sentiment from 2011, when we had the worst of the floods that we've had in my living memory. And I remember how people banded together. And there was that great sense that no matter how far the chips were down, people would stick together, and that we would fight, and that we really didn't want to see this sort of thing happen again, and we would stick together so that it didn't. Well, with the action that this parliament's proposing to take tonight, we can expect more of those sorts of floods. We can expect more of the terrible bushfires that the rest of the nation experienced, and Queensland did too in some places. We can expect more of those vicious cyclones that attack our coastlines and ruin so many people's homes, and with the loss of so much life. That we're even contemplating taking an action that would invite that sort of consequence is just absolutely mind-boggling to me. But I want to mention particularly a place that's really close to my heart, and that I hope many Queenslanders and in fact many Australians feel similarly about, and that's the Great Barrier Reef. For a long time now we've known that climate change is the biggest threat to the reef, and we've known, sadly, that it's not just a 2-degree rise in the temperature that will see the reef acidify, damage those coral structures, massive coral bleaching. In fact, the latest science is that with a 1-degree temperature rise, we will see mass bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. We are on track for that. We are already at 0.8 of a degree rise. There is real peril facing the reef. And whilst I love the reef for its beauty and its biodiversity and the fact that it is one of the most wonderful places that I've ever had the joy of experiencing, it's also the employer of 63,000 people. It is a huge backbone of the Queensland economy. It's our most popular tourist attraction. It supports many sustainable fishing industries. It supports our most popular tourism icon. In fact, a recent study found that it contributes almost $6 billion to Queensland's economy every year. Now, that's an awful lot of money, and that's money that could continue to roll into our coffers for the foreseeable future with no end if we actually looked after the reef. And it's not just beautiful, and it's not just a job creator. It's actually really important biophysically. It is a barrier from the coastline, from those damaging tropical storms and cyclones that we can expect more of. It's a physical barrier without which Queensland coast would be a far more dangerous place to live. I've talked already about the fact that climate change will cause mass coral bleaching, and we know that corals are highly sensitive to effectively what are underwater heat waves. Before 1979, there was no scientific reports of mass coral bleaching and coral death, but in the last 25 years there have been numerous events. In both 1998 and 2002, we had over 50% of the reef affected by bleaching, and we lost about 10% of the corals. And by 2050, if carbon emissions across the world are not drastically reduced, it's expected that such events will result in the loss of 100% of corals in the reef. That is the entire Great Barrier Reef lost by 2050 if we remain on the emissions trajectory that we are on, and if we continue tonight with the foolish and self-invested and disgusting proposal to repeal our climate laws. Now, I can't believe that the parliament is actually facing that choice and making the choice to get rid of climate action and just to sacrifice the reef. And for what? For that 3-word slogan, for the profits of a few fossil fuel companies, most of whom we know are overseas owned, who don't deliver dividends to the Australian economy, who don't generate that many jobs, and who don't keep the economy ticking, although they like to, of course, claim and frequently overinflate their influence on the economy. The Galilee Basin, along with the Great Barrier Reef, is in my home state of Queensland, and of course it's the latest coal resource that the big miners want to get their teeth into. Mr Palmer is one of those such miners, as is Gina Reinhardt and a number of other huge Indian conglomerates. Now, the Galilee Basin is the biggest coal deposit that we have in this nation, and if it were mined, as the big miners propose, the Galilee Basin would be the 7th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. It would rank as the 7th largest country, if it were to be considered a country, should all of that coal be burnt. Now, thanks very much, Mr Palmer, for directing your senators tonight to ensure that your profits will be able to continue, to ensure that you will be able to plunder the Galilee Basin with impunity. I think you'll find that Queenslanders have quite a lot to say about that at the very next opportunity that they have to express their views. I'm also disappointed in the Palmer United Party's amendment that we saw tonight, how quickly they rolled over on what was a fairly expansive amendment last week, now much diminished, and in fact again much lampooned for the fact that it won't deliver a $550 dividend to households. In fact, it might be more like 80 or 100, maybe not even that. Well, what a surprise that all of the claims about the carbon tax being a wrecking ball through the economy didn't eventuate. And I think households will soon realise that. I'm sure they're expecting to get an awful lot of refund. They'll soon find that actually there's not that much due back, because the carbon tax was not that much of an impost, and in fact it was doing good work in bringing down emissions. I want to take the chance to apologise to my daughter and for future generations to come for this parliament failing them tonight and selling out their future and sacrificing their health and their way of life for the sake of propping up the big polluters. We've seen tonight a triumph of profit over people and politics over science. It makes absolutely no economic sense. Again, I harken back to money as the currency, it seems, in so many ways in this place. It makes absolutely no economic sense to stymie the burgeoning renewable sector and to see those job-rich industries flourish. We know that that is where our economic profitability will lie into the future. We know that that's where infinitely more jobs will be created than the increasingly mechanised fossil fuel industries. And we know that that is actually where the world is going and where we should go if we want to have our place as an economic and a climate leader on this planet. As I've mentioned already, direct action is basically a slush fund for the big polluters. It's a complete sham. There's not an economist or a scientist that's backed it. And the government has not even committed to ensuring that a 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions would occur through direct action, because they've capped the amount that they're going to pay out to the big polluters under that ridiculously titled excuse for a policy. And it's funny, isn't it, that we see that the government apparently doesn't believe in supporting industry. I harken back to cars, SPC, Qantas, but all of a sudden they're very willing to make big handouts to the fossil fuel industries. I want to remind senators in this chamber who have espoused the need for an emissions trading scheme that we have an emissions trading scheme, and we will have it for possibly another 2-3 hours, depending on how long it takes this government to chop through their pathetic repeal legislation, treating this Senate like a rubber stamp after having sold out to the latest people who've arrived. We have an emissions trading scheme. It's working. We have moved, as have other people in this place, moved to bring forward the floating price on the existing emissions trading scheme that we have. So many of the stated demands of some of the other senators in this place would be met with that course of action. I ask them in the remaining time that we have for this excellent policy to seriously consider that. If this parliament votes down the carbon price tonight, it stands condemned as a parliament dominated by old white men out of touch with science and ruled by greed. But I echo the words of Senator Christine Milne. And I'm sorry, Senator Nash, I do note the presence of you in this chamber as a woman, one of the few women on that side of the chamber. Thank you for being here, and please have a word with your colleagues. But I echo Senator Milne's comment that we may lose this fight, but we will not lose this war. The momentum is there. The community is with climate action. People out there know that global warming is real and they want to do something about it because they actually think about the future. They don't just think about their hip pockets, and they certainly don't think about the private profits of overseas mining companies. I'm excited by the folk that we have coming to Parliament on a regular basis, and particularly the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, who came here last week when we last thought that we would lose these good laws. And they had such hope and such optimism, and they are our future leaders. And they are the people that we here are meant to be representing, all of us. Certainly the Greens are doing that job. They will be the people who inherit the future that we create with the decisions we'll make tonight. And whilst I am incredibly disheartened about the decision that I expect this Parliament will take, I have unshakable optimism that not even this torrid government can stop the momentum that is climate action. Clearly the rest of the world is moving. Australia is evidently going to have a little bit of a setback, but it won't last. We will get back on board. We have too much at stake and too much to lose, and there are too many people who know that that's the case for this pathetic and underbaked policy of the governments to stand. So the future is looking bright, despite all attempts of the Abbott government to keep us in the past and to keep us wedded to the fossil fuel sector. We have so many people across Australia, and this isn't just, you know, the inner-city latte-sipping elites, as perhaps this government might like to try and marginalise anyone who cares about their future or their children's future. This is people in rural Australia, and particularly I want to pay tribute to those in the coal seam gas movement, Lock the Gate and the like, who have stood to protect their land, their water, but also the climate from this latest fossil fuel destruction waiting to happen, that is coal seam gas, shale gas, tight gas and other unconventional gas, with the hydraulic fracturing that breaks open these seams, lets the gas flow and doesn't really mind when it leaks out of those pipes and wells, doesn't really mind how much energy it takes to liquefy for export, because much of it is for export. This is the latest war in the climate war, and we will oppose coal seam gas as we oppose extended coal mining. And being from Queensland, I want to reiterate the importance of that policy principle, which Senator Milne has foreshadowed an amendment on to these bills tonight. We are exporting an enormous amount of coal to the world. It is doing us no favours. It is doing the rest of the planet and all of the other species that we share this place with absolutely no favours. There is no way that we should be increasing that coal export. And maybe 10 years ago that might have been taboo to say, being from Queensland, but that is a very increasing and widely held view. So we will stand to protect the Great Barrier Reef from the effects of climate change. We will stand against the rapacious dredging and dumping to make ports bigger, to export out coal and coal seam gas, as if the reef was just a highway for fossil fuels and not actually one of the 7 natural wonders of the world that is the most beautiful place you can ever hope to experience. We will stand against the short-sighted and self-invested greed of people in this place who would rather sacrifice the future of all of our children for the private profits of some multinationals. And you will not dull our spirit, and you will not dull our motivation. And ultimately we will prevail.